They said I stole from them, that I was dangerous. So they cut me off, packed my bags, and erased me like I'd never existed. But while they smeared my name, I was building something that could one day save their lives. Now they're back knocking on my door. But this time, I hold the keys. Elena Grayson had driven the familiar highway back to Chandler, Arizona countless times. But this time, the sky felt closer, like it might collapse. The sun had dipped below the desert horizon, casting long shadows across the saguaro cacti that lined the roadside. The air warm and still stuck to her skin like a second thought. She arrived at her childhood home just after 7, a full hour past the family dinner her father had texted about 2 days prior. Everyone home Sunday. Dinner at 6. Don't be late. He hadn't said why. That wasn't unusual. Her family didn't ask, they declared. As she pulled into the driveway, her headlights flickered across the garage door, a door she'd once slammed as a teenager after failing her first organic chemistry exam, a door she'd opened 100 times since then, always half hoping someone inside would meet her with arms open wide. Tonight, no one came. She stepped into the house. Silence met her like a brick wall. There was no aroma of her mother's baked ziti. No clatter of plates, no scent of Caesar dressing from the store-bought bottle they all pretended was homemade. Just the low hum of the ceiling fan and the sound of her own breath, sharp and tentative. They were already seated in the living room, her father Gerald in his usual armchair, her mother Lucille on the edge of the couch with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her siblings Eli and Madeline stiff as marble bookends. Her father didn't stand. He didn't offer a hug. "You're late," he said flatly. Elena offered a half smile. "Traffic on I-10. Sorry." No one responded. No one asked about school or her research or whether she'd eaten. Instead, Eli leaned forward, a manila envelope in hand. His expression was smug, as if he'd just pulled the ace from his sleeve. "Elena," he said, "you've been taking money." She blinked. "What?" "From Mom and Dad's retirement account. I have statements." He slid the envelope across the coffee table toward her. She didn't touch it. "That's not true," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. Madeline didn't wait. And she said, her tone poisonous, rehearsed. "You've been seeing Dr. Chase, the married doctor at Banner Hospital. Everyone knows. And don't act like you didn't come on to my fiancé. He told me what you tried to do." Elena stared at her sister, heart thudding against her ribs. "You think I would do that?" "Seriously, Maddie?" Madeline looked away, but her jaw was set like stone. Eli crossed his arms, smug. Her mother lowered her eyes. Her father, as always, just watched. "No one even asked me," Elena said louder. "You're all just throwing accusations like they're facts." Lucille's voice was soft, almost mournful. "You've changed, Elena. We don't recognize who you've become." "No," Elena said. "You never really tried to know me." Gerald raised a hand, cutting her off. "We've talked," he said. "And we've made a decision." The pause before his next sentence felt eternal. "We're removing you from the family trust, and we think it's best you leave tonight." There it was. Not a slap, not a scream, but something colder, the erasure of identity. A sentence that cracked the foundation of everything she thought was still intact. "Leave," she repeated. Eli stood. "You have 1 hour. We packed a bag." Madeline's eyes didn't meet hers. "It's in the hallway." Elena rose to her feet. For a moment, it felt like her soul had slipped out of her body and was watching from the ceiling. The family photos on the wall seemed to mock her birthday parties, holidays, graduation. Proof that once she'd been part of this place. She walked past her mother, who didn't look up. Past her siblings, whose smug expressions said this wasn't about justice, it was about winning. Past the kitchen, where she used to sneak extra garlic bread as a child. Through the hallway where laughter used to live. In the garage, she saw her father by the trash bin. He was tossing something in a black photo album with her name etched in cursive gold. She stopped. "Seriously?" she asked. He shrugged. "Didn't think you'd need this where you're going." The plastic lid of the bin closed with a hollow finality. Elena said nothing. She wouldn't give them tears, not now, not here. Her legs carried her to the car, but her heart was somewhere else entirely. She drove without direction, fingers trembling on the steering wheel. It wasn't until she passed the blinking vacancy sign of a roadside motel on Van Buren that she finally pulled over. Inside the room smelled of bleach and resignation. The walls were beige, the bedspread patterned in a design no one had loved in decades. She sat at the edge of the mattress, staring at the silence. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't cry. Only when she went to the bathroom did she realize something deeper was shifting. Her hand trembled as she reached into her purse for the small plastic test. 10 minutes later, under sickly yellow light, she watched 2 pink lines bloom like scars. Pregnant. Not alone. Not erased. She walked back into the room and sat at the small desk by the window. Outside, the vacancy sign buzzed faintly like a neon heart trying to stay alive. She opened the side pocket of the duffel bag her siblings had so helpfully packed. They hadn't found the leather journal from college. Inside were the pages she'd written when no one else was listening, proof that she had always been more than their shadow. She stared at the reflection in the motel window, then whispered to the tiny life forming inside her, voice steady. You were the only truth they couldn't erase. And with that the silence broke. Not with sound, but with resolve. The motel room felt colder than it should have for spring in Arizona. Not the kind of cold that came from an aging wall unit or thin carpet. This was emotional frost, the aftermath of being cast out. Elena lay on the edge of the bed, not beneath the blanket, but on top of it, fully dressed, shoes still on. Her eyes were open, fixed on the water stain blooming across the ceiling like a ghost. Her thoughts weren't coherent, not yet. They moved like vapor scattered, drifting without anchor. The silence pressed in. It wasn't peaceful. It was void. She reached into her purse and pulled out the plastic pharmacy bag, crinkling softly like the last remnant of normalcy. The pregnancy tests were inside. She hadn't allowed herself to think too much at the gas station. She'd bought them with the robotic efficiency of someone buying batteries or hand soap. Now they felt heavier than steel. In the dim, buzzing light of the bathroom, she tore open the package with trembling fingers. Her hands still smelled faintly of motel bleach. She placed the test on the sink and stared at her reflection. The mirror had a crack in the top corner running diagonally like a scar across a cheekbone. Her own face looked older tonight, hollowed, not because of time, but because of abandonment. 3 minutes. That was the promise on the box. She stood motionless, arms crossed. Then, unable to resist, she peeked early. 2 pink lines. No hesitation. No ambiguity. Pregnant. She didn't collapse. Didn't gasp or scream. No hand flew to her mouth. Instead, she leaned closer to the mirror. Met her own eyes with a steadiness she didn't know she still possessed, and whispered, "You were the one truth they couldn't erase." The words were a whisper, but they reverberated inside her bones in the silence of that room, in the vast hollowness her family had left behind. They'd cast her out like refuse, convinced of a version of her that never existed. But here in this rundown motel, something sacred stirred. Life. Not theory, not research. Real, irrefutable. And it was hers. She walked back to the desk and sat down, the test still in her hand. Outside the window, the neon vacancy sign flickered. A couple's muffled argument drifted in from the next room. Somewhere a child laughed faintly in the parking lot, an unexpected sound almost like hope. Elena opened the duffel bag her siblings had packed for her, stuffed haphazardly with clothes, toiletries, and nothing personal. But they had missed one thing, a small side pocket zipped shut. Her fingers slipped inside and closed around soft leather. Her journal. It had gone with her everywhere since undergrad. A black notebook frayed at the edges, water-warped from that flood in junior year. It had survived more than some people in her life. She opened to a random entry. March 12th. Eli asked for help on the capstone project. Pretended to care. I explained gene splicing protocols line by line. He nodded like he was listening. Later during the presentation, he used my entire section, word for word. No credit. Dad framed the professor's email praising his initiative. Mom clapped. I said nothing. Again. Her fingers tightened around the pen marks. She could still feel the burn in her chest from that day watching them celebrate his theft like it was a family victory. She flipped further back. July 3rd. Madeline told everyone Grandma gave me her pearl bracelet out of pity. Because Elena's not pretty enough to win anything on her own, she said. No one disagreed. Grandma didn't say anything at the time, but later she found me in the kitchen. She held my hand and said, "You see deeper than they ever will. That's why they fear you." The ache in her throat returned raw and quiet. Grandma Roslyn, the only person who had ever really seen her, she remembered the smell of lemon balm and gardenia whenever Roslyn hugged her. Remembered the soft weight of that sapphire wedding ring, the one Grandma said would be hers one day. But when Roslyn died, it was Madeline who showed up wearing it at the funeral. She'd held her hand out like a model showing the ring as if it had always belonged there. Elena hadn't said a word. She thought silence might preserve peace. But now she knew better. In this room in the flickering shadow of abandonment, she wasn't just pregnant. She wasn't just a victim. She was the bearer of something unstealable truth. She pressed the journal to her chest. A new voice entered her memory. Roslyn's voice from a late-night phone call during finals week, her sophomore year. Ellie, don't let the world trick you into thinking quiet means weak. Some of the strongest things grow in silence roots, character babies. She smiled faintly. Babies, she murmured aloud. Plural. As if the child within her had heard a flutter of something low in her belly nudged at her awareness. Not movement, not yet, but awareness. She placed her palm flat against her abdomen, protective without realizing it. You're not just mine, she whispered. You're ours. You're the line they can't redraw no matter how hard they try. That night she didn't fall asleep. She drifted half dreaming, half building futures in her mind. Futures where her name didn't need permission to be spoken. Futures where her child would never wonder if they belonged at the dinner table. And when the sun finally cracked across the Arizona horizon, golden and indifferent, Elena sat upright and wrote her first words in a new section of the journal. They threw me away like I was a lie. But I carry the proof inside me. And this time, the story starts with me. Elena hadn't expected the knock. She hadn't told anyone where she was, hadn't posted anything, hadn't even let her phone's location settings stay on. She was somewhere between hiding and hibernating, half buried under betrayal, half incubating something holy. The motel was forgettable, the kind of place where even the air felt disposable. And yet there it was, a knock. Not sharp, not demanding, just a steady rhythm like someone who wasn't afraid to wait. She hesitated, heartbeats stuttering. Then she opened the door. There he stood, Camden Hall. His gray t-shirt clung softly to his frame sleeves, rolled just enough to show faint tan lines on his forearms. His hair was longer than she remembered, a little unkempt, but his eyes, those calm, grounded eyes, hadn't changed. He didn't smile, didn't reach forward. He just looked at her like she wasn't broken, like she wasn't a scandal, like she was still her. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she stepped back, and he stepped in. They didn't hug, didn't cry. The silence between them was full, but not awkward like music, paused, not lost. He sat in the chair by the window. She perched on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap. She could still hear the hum of traffic beyond the blinds, feel the test strip like a weight in her purse. The room was dim, but warmer now. "I didn't expect you," she said finally. "I didn't expect me either," Camden replied. She turned to him. "How did you even find me?" He gave a small shrug. "I asked around. Called the gas station near your parents' street. The clerk said someone had bought ginger ale and pregnancy tests last night, looked like they hadn't slept. I figured that was you." She laughed, a short, breathless thing that wasn't quite humor. Still putting puzzle pieces together, she murmured. He smiled then. Barely. Always. For the long moment they just sat. Then she whispered, I'm pregnant. Camden didn't flinch. Didn't blink. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a pen, scribbled something on a paper napkin from the desk, and slid it toward her. One word. Together. She stared at it like it was written in a language she hadn't spoken in years. You don't even know what you're signing up for, she said. Maybe not, he replied, but I know what I walked away from. He didn't mean her. Not directly. He meant his life. She remembered barely the outlines of his world. Old money, East Coast. Biotech patents and family vineyards. Prep schools, holiday galas, 5-syllable expectations. She'd caught glimpses of it in college, but Camden had always kept it at arm's length. Now he said it outright. They had a list, he said. The kind of woman I was supposed to marry. The kind of company I was supposed to fund. The kind of lies I was supposed to rehearse. She looked at him, eyebrows raised. I chose quiet instead, he added. Until now. The silence returned deeper this time, textured. I saw it, you know, Camden said after a moment. That day at the University Innovators Summit, Eli on stage, presenting your research. He didn't even change the slide design. Elena froze. You were in the crowd. I was in the back. He nodded. I watched you sit 2 rows behind your father while he clapped like Eli had cured cancer. Her throat tightened. I saw the way Eli looked at you when the applause started, Camden said softly. He knew. And I knew. But no one said anything. Not even you. Elena's hands curled into fists in her lap. That presentation was the basis of his first internship, she said quietly. The one that got him into BloomGen. I wrote that proposal during finals week while working midnight shifts at the library. Camden didn't interrupt. I submitted it under the team's name, she continued. He submitted it under his. Camden's voice was low, and they believed him. They always do. Elena stared at the napkin between them. That single word, together. Not a promise, a proposal. They'll try to rewrite everything she said. Pretend I never existed. He nodded. Then we'll write louder. But that wasn't what Elena wanted. Not noise. She wanted clarity, stillness, roots. You know, she said, Madeline once told me that I'd never matter until someone else claimed me. Camden didn't react. I used to believe that, she whispered, but not anymore. She met his gaze. Now I think the only way to matter is to claim myself. There was a long, beautiful pause. Camden reached across the space between them, not to take her hand, but to lay his palm beside it. A gesture. Not possession. Presence. A choice. Later that night they drove. His old truck still vibrated the way she remembered. The windows stuck. The radio crackled when it changed stations. But the seat was warm and the road stretched forward like it had missed her. They ended up at a diner with cracked vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone hone. The kind of place where no one asked questions, where the world outside didn't matter. They sat across from each other, coffee cups steaming. I'm not asking you to forgive them, Camden said, but I'd like to help you build something better. And for the first time in weeks, Elena didn't feel exiled. She felt begun. The downtown branch of the Chandler Public Library was never meant for dreams. It was the kind of place where the carpet was a little too thin, where every desk wobbled to the left and the overhead lights buzzed just slightly louder than appropriate. But for Elena Grayson, it became her incubator. Each morning she arrived before the doors fully unlocked. She'd settle into the far corner by the Windows laptop, open a stack of legal pads beside her and a second-hand thermos that no longer kept things warm, but gave her something to hold on to. She had no office, no capital, no co-founders. Just a cracked screen, a notebook filled with sketches, and the thrum of something relentless beneath her skin. And she had a name. Sawline? Bio. Simple. Stark. 2 syllables that held everything. saw not as in weapon, but vision. She saw the truth before anyone else dared to name it. Line as in lineage, bloodlines, beginnings. But also direction, continuation, a story she would now tell on her own terms. She filed the LLC paperwork in the library's slow Wi-Fi silence. Each form submitted was a reclamation. Her name on the signature line felt heavier than any thesis submission had. It was no longer tied to faculty approval or family reputation. It was hers. Elena Marie Grayson, founder. The words looked unreal at first, until they weren't. The first few weeks were consumed by research not of molecules or cell lines, but of contracts, trademarks, licensing frameworks. She devoured legal texts the way she used to memorize biochemical pathways. She studied case law on patent disputes between startups and universities. She read every clause with the surgical precision of someone who'd already lost too much to casual theft. She learned the language they used to steal brilliance politely: team contribution, non-attributable material, shared innovation. She wrote in the margins, "Not this time." Every day she created a new folder on her laptop: regulatory paths, clinical trial requirements, case studies on scalable diagnostics. She had pages on nonprofit partnership models and a spreadsheet of community clinics across rural Arizona. The product not fully formed, but the why was already clear. A low-cost, high-accuracy hormonal assay, something that could detect early hormone shifts in women's health far earlier than current methods allowed, especially for underfunded clinics, especially for women like her overlooked until it was too late. She wasn't building tech for VC applause. She was building something quietly life-saving. One afternoon, while bookmarking a legal resource on digital proof of authorship, she paused on an old file name from her cloud storage. Thesis, proposal, draft, original, NMG. The initials hers. She hadn't opened it in years. The file predated Eli's version by at least 4 months. Inside were full sections on gene-modified immune proteins, a use case scenario for early detection of hormone deficiencies, and a section titled, "The Body as Archive Inheriting Systems Were Told to Forget." The phrase hit her like a wave. She hadn't just written science. She had woven herself into it. Her fingers hovered over the touchpad. Then she added a line to her company pitch deck. "We are not starting from scratch. We are continuing from silence." That night, back in Camden's apartment, Elena sat at the kitchen counter while he reheated leftover rice in a pan that had seen better days. "You okay?" he asked gently. "I'm getting there," she replied, eyes still on her screen. He didn't press. Instead, he placed a fresh pen beside her elbow, his quiet offering. She smiled just faintly. They didn't talk about her family. Not anymore. Not in depth. But sometimes echoes surfaced. Like the voicemail Elena had replayed in her head countless times, her mother's voice tight and cold. "You don't have the presence for leadership, Elena. You're too plain, too passive. People won't follow someone who disappears in a room." She had been 17. It was after a student council election she didn't even run for. A teacher had nominated her. She'd declined, too nervous, too invisible, too... Now, years later, she typed the sentence slowly at the bottom of her draft pitch. "Leadership doesn't require spectacle, just substance that refuses to vanish." The next morning, she arrived at the library early as usual. The security guard Bernard waved her in with a nod. He had started reserving her favorite spot without ever saying so. She unzipped her backpack, pulled out a single page she'd printed the night before. It was a mock-up of her startup's mission statement. Just 8 lines. She taped it to the wall above her desk next to a faded flyer advertising ESL classes. Sawline Bio. We build what was denied. We serve what was ignored. We diagnose what was dismissed. We protect what was inherited. We name what was stolen. We correct what was silenced. We lead without spectacle. We grow what they buried. She stared at it for a long time. No fanfare, no framed office, no applause. But it was hers, And this time she would make damn sure her name wasn't in the footnotes. The startup showcase was hosted in one of those modern co-working spaces that smelled like over-extracted espresso and ambition. Polished concrete floors, vertical gardens, inspirational quotes and minimalist fonts taped to white walls. Elena arrived in a borrowed navy blue dress, one of the few that still fit over her barely there bump. She pulled her hair into a low bun, clipped gold hoops to her ears, and steadied herself in the mirror by the elevator. "You belong here," she whispered. "Not because they say so. Because you built something." Upstairs, the room hummed with startup energy founders rehearsing pitches, advisors reviewing portfolios, tech demos, glowing blue and green from corner stations. Elena took her badge from the check-in table. It read, Elena Grayson, founder, Sawline Bio. No suffix, no PhD in progress, just the truth. Camden didn't come inside. He stayed parked across the street sipping gas station coffee and watching the door. "You go in alone," he'd said that morning. "Not because you're alone, but because this is yours." When her name was called, she stepped up to the podium with her laptop already connected. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice was calm. She spoke with the precision she'd cultivated in years of defending her work in rooms full of louder people. She outlined the diagnostic model, explained the assay's precision rate, walked through the roadmap early phase development pilot program in underserved clinics, data optimization through an open access model. She didn't apologize for the simplicity of her graphics. She didn't smile more than necessary. She didn't thank them in excess. She let the work speak. And for a moment, it felt like enough. Until the man in the gray blazer leaned back in his chair, tapped his pen once, and smiled. "Not kindly. I'll be blunt," he said. "Impressive idea. Thoughtful design. But we've already seen our share of single pregnant founders trying to prove a point." The room didn't laugh, but no one spoke either. Not a word, not a murmur of dissent, not a cough, not a shuffled paper. Elena blinked. Her lips parted, but she didn't answer. She simply closed her laptop, gave a curt nod, and walked off the stage. She didn't remember taking the elevator down. She didn't remember crossing the street. She just remembered the burn behind her eyes and the nausea crawling up her throat. She barely made it around the corner of the building before she vomited sharp and acidic into a bush that hadn't been watered in weeks. A few moments later, she found the public restroom inside a nearby coffee shop. The stall door creaked shut behind her like it was ashamed to bear witness. She leaned her head against the cool metal of the wall, eyes closed. From the next stall, a woman spoke. Older nasal voice, clipped unfiltered. "Girls like that shouldn't breed." Elena froze. The toilet flushed and the woman emerged from her stall heels, clicking on the tile. Elena waited a beat, then stepped out herself. Their eyes met in the mirror. The woman looked her over once. Her dress, her face, her flat shoes, her belly. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Elena turned away, washed her hands in silence, and left. Back in Camden's truck, the seatbelt settled across her lap like a question. She didn't cry. Not even when he asked gently, "Want to talk about it?" She shook her head. But later that night, while he cooked dinner pasta with too much garlic the way she liked it, she opened the side flap of her duffel bag and pulled out the photograph. It had been folded for so long the creases were nearly permanent. Her thumb traced the edge before she opened it fully. There it was, a moment from years ago captured in imperfect lighting. She and Grandma Roslyn caught mid-laugh at Madeline's bridal shower. Elena wore a hand-sewn blue dress that didn't quite fit right. Her curls were pinned back with plastic clips. Roslyn wore lavender, her lipstick just slightly smudged at the corners. But it wasn't their smiles that held her now. It was their hands. In the lower corner of the photo, subtle and almost hidden Roslyn's fingers were curled around Elena's. In the crook of that gentle grip, barely visible unless you knew to look, was the family ring. A sapphire stone set in a simple gold band. Roslyn hadn't made a speech. She hadn't wrapped it in a velvet box. She'd just pressed it into Elena's palm that afternoon when no one was watching. "For who you are," she'd whispered, "not who they say you should be." The next week, Rosalind passed away. At the will reading, Madeline arrived wearing the ring. "Grandma said it should go to the first daughter to marry," she announced. No one questioned it. No one looked at Elena. And Elena. Elena had stayed silent. Until now. She stared at the photo until the blur in her eyes wasn't rage but clarity. What they had stolen wasn't just jewelry. It was narrative. It was legacy. But this photograph was the original story, the one that mattered. She folded the photo again gently this time and slipped it back into her wallet behind her ID. Then she opened her laptop and added a slide to her pitch deck. One photo, no title, no caption, just her and Rosalind, hands clasped, a ring passed like a torch. Beneath it in small type, "They erased me from the version they wanted. But I have the one that's true." The Phoenix courthouse didn't look like a place where truth lived. It looked like a place that had forgotten what truth felt like: limestone walls, cold benches, an air conditioning system that hummed with indifference. But Elena walked through its glass doors with her shoulders square and her documents in hand. She wore a navy blazer, the same one her mother once said made her look too sharp, too masculine for a daughter. Today it felt like armor. Camden walked beside her until the courtroom doors. Then he stopped. "You don't need me in there to win," he said softly. "But I'll be in the second row just in case you want to look over and remember someone sees you." She nodded, touched his hand briefly, and entered. At the front of the courtroom, a woman judge sat beneath the seal of the state of Arizona, her hair coiled tightly like a crown of rope. Her eyes scanned the docket as though she'd already seen the shape of 100 betrayals this week. Still, she paused when she read the case title, Grayson versus Grayson. On the right side of the room sat Madeline, poised in a cream sheath dress, her eyes hidden behind thick lashes, her lips perfectly neutral. Next to her, a team of lawyers who smiled without warmth. Her parents were seated behind her. Lucille stared straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge her daughter's presence. Gerald glanced down at folded hands that had once held Elena's toddler frame. No one waved. No one nodded. Just blood divided by rows. The hearing began. Elena's attorney, Renee Wallace, a calm but sharp woman who had once dismantled a pharmaceutical giant in court, with only a binder, and her voice stood and began. "Your Honor, Renee said we are not simply alleging intellectual property theft. We are presenting a pattern of misattribution, appropriation, and reputational sabotage beginning with university projects and culminating in the recent NIH grant awarded to the defendant under falsified authorship." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." They submitted the first piece of evidence, the original research files from Elena's university cloud drive, time-stamped, annotated in her distinct handwriting. Then came the emails from professors, peer-reviewed notes, meeting minutes. And finally, a letter from Dr. Kaneshiro, Elena's former mentor, who confirmed under oath that Madeline had never participated in any original scientific research while enrolled. Still, Madeline's lawyer rose smooth as silk. "This," he said, "is an unfortunate familial misunderstanding. Sibling rivalry, miscommunication about collaborative boundaries. Tragic, yes, but not criminal." Renee didn't miss a beat. "May I respond?" The judge nodded. Renee turned to Elena. "Ms. Grayson." Elena stood. Her voice did not tremble. "No family," she said, "who calls your silence obedience deserves your forgiveness." The air shifted. Even the opposing counsel paused. "I stayed quiet for years," she continued. "Let them take credit. Let them twist the story. But silence isn't kindness. And erasure isn't misunderstanding. It's theft." Her gaze moved to her parents, not with anger but with clarity. "They taught me that belonging came with conditions, that being believed was a luxury I hadn't earned. But I've earned this. Every word, every number, every slide in that deck, every idea they buried under someone else's name, I pulled it from the dirt myself." There was no applause. Only silence, the kind that comes when truth lands like a stone in still water. The judge tapped her pen once, then again. "I've heard enough," she said. In a voice low but resonant, she delivered her verdict. Effective immediately, Madeline Grayson is prohibited from representing, applying for, or receiving benefit from any federal or nonprofit grant funding based on intellectual property originating from Phoenix Biotech or the personal research of Elena Grayson. Furthermore, any materials published under the Foundation's name must be withdrawn or corrected to reflect the rightful author. Madeline's posture didn't change, but her jaw twitched just once. Elena didn't look at her sister. She looked down at her own hands. They were steady. The gavel came down. Just like that, what had once been stolen was returned not as a gift, but as a consequence. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. "Grayson, any comment on the ruling? Do you have anything to say to your family?" Elena paused only once, then said evenly, "No. I said what mattered in court." She stepped past them through the glass doors into the Arizona sun that was far too bright for grief. Camden was already walking beside her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. But when they reached the sidewalk, he took her hand not in celebration but in acknowledgement. She had not just won. She had reclaimed. The backyard was nothing special, just a narrow strip of earth boxed in by stucco walls bordered with sun-faded bricks and the remnants of a once-forgotten flower bed. But to Elena, it was sacred ground. Today, it would become something else, a beginning. Camden stood at the edge of the space, adjusting a small wooden swing he'd fastened beneath the pergola beam. His shirt was streaked with sawdust, and the collar of his t-shirt curled outward like it had been chewed by time. Lila and Orion, now 3 and full of feral wonder, knelt in the dirt beside Elena. Each clutched a plastic trowel with the intensity of heart surgeons. Mommy Lila announced proudly, "This one's my tree. Lemon, like Grandma Rosalind's tea." Elena smiled, planting a kiss on her daughter's forehead. "That's right." And what's Orion solemn and focused as always, pointed to the sapling on his left, orange, like sunsets. He was right. The label said navel orange, but the leaves shimmered like burnt gold in the morning light. They dug side by side, tiny hands and calloused ones building something slowly. No hurry, no audience, just sweat, soil, and the silence of knowing this mattered. Roots don't ask for applause. They ask for depth. Elena reached into the planting bag, pulled out compost with the careful precision of a woman who had measured lives in grams, milliliters, and gene markers. Camden brought over the watering can, and together they baptized the saplings in silence. "This one's going to be strong," Camden murmured, gently patting the soil. "I can feel it." She nodded. "They both will. Like their namesakes." Lila and Orion each placed a small painted rock at the base of their trees. One had glitter, the other a crudely drawn star. Camden wrapped his arm around Elena's waist. "You ever think you'd get here?" "Not once," she admitted. And yet here they were. Not in a high-rise office. Not in a courtroom. Not in a gala filled with curated applause. But in their backyard. Growing what no one else had ever offered her. Later that afternoon, after bath-time snacks and 1,000 tiny negotiations that came with toddlerhood, the twins finally curled up for their naps. Elena sat on the porch steps barefoot and flushed from sun and motherhood. Camden came outside holding a plain manila envelope. "I have something," he said. "You should see it." She looked up. "Good something or bad?" He didn't answer, just handed her the envelope. Her name was written across the front in Rosalind's handwriting, slanted and looping, filled with that old-school grace. Elena's breath caught. "I was clearing out some of her boxes at the community center," Camden explained. "The ones that didn't make it to the estate lawyers. There were albums, cards, letters she never sent." Elena opened the flap and slid out a photograph. Her fingers froze. It was the photo. The one she remembered from childhood. In the original version, she'd been cropped out, only the corner of her dress remained a phantom limb of memory. It had once sat framed on the family piano, presented as a curated slice of familial love. Madeline beaming in her pageant dress, Eli with his science fair trophy, their parents proud and polished. But here, the real one. Elena was in its slightly off-center, mid-laugh dress, wrinkled socks mismatched. Grandma Roslyn stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, the other holding a lemonade pitcher. No edits, no curation, just truth. Tears welled without falling. She turned the photo over. On the back in blue ink, Roslyn had written, "This is the version that matters. See?" Elena pressed the image to her chest, heart thudding, not from pain, but from memory returning whole. "I didn't think this existed anymore," she whispered. "It always did," Camden said softly. "They just hid it." That evening they sat under the pergola with 2 glasses of lemonade and no expectations. The orange and lemon trees stood behind them like sentinels, their new roots quietly winding downward in the cooling earth. The breeze smelled like citrus and rosemary. Somewhere a neighbor's wind chime tapped against the quiet like a gentle reminder, "You're safe now." Camden looked over at her. "You okay?" Elena didn't answer right away. She gazed at the tiny grove they'd planted, the swing swaying lazily in the wind, the small blue shoe Lila had left near the planter box. She looked down at her hands lined from work, faintly stained from the lab, yet still warm enough to grow things. Then she looked at Camden. "I'm not just okay," she said. "I'm exactly who I was meant to be." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just reached over and rested his hand on hers, no grip, no claim. Just a quiet agreement. The screen door creaked open. 2 pairs of feet pattered toward them. "Look, Mommy." Orion held up a ladybug like a miracle. She came to visit the orange tree Lila twirled behind him, arms wide. "We're nature now." Elena laughed full and bright. They had erased her once, but she hadn't fought to be remembered. She had planted something too real to ignore. The conference center buzzed with the energy of overachievement name badges swinging on lanyards, laptops flashing with data visualizations, conversations clipped and caffeinated. Elena moved through it all with quiet composure, her steps steady on the marble floors. Her blazer was pressed, her pitch deck loaded, and the soft swell beneath her blouse barely visible served as the only ornament she needed. Camden had dropped her off 2 blocks away as always. "You don't need an entrance," he'd said. "You are one." As she approached the main hall, her gaze caught on a banner outside the ballroom. 10 feet tall, silk-printed, perfectly lit. "Women Leading the Future of Health," presented by the Madeline Grayson Foundation, front and center. Madeline's face. Eyes cast modestly downward, arms crossed. Chin lifted, just so. Below it, in elegant serif font. "The body is its own archive. Sometimes what it remembers can save lives." Elena stopped. Her stomach didn't turn. Her heart didn't race. She simply recognized it. That sentence had come from her first thesis draft, word for word. No attribution, no footnote, no mention of sawline bio. Of her. Someone brushed past her. "You okay?" they asked, not stopping. She nodded, then walked inside. The room was shaped like a theater, tiered seats, dimmed lights, a podium at center stage. A screen behind the speaker scrolled through sponsor logos and speaker names. Her session was last in the lineup. She waited backstage, watching the flow of presentations, each more polished than the last. Impeccable slides, funded ventures, accolades delivered like oxygen. Then her name. Dr. Elena Grayson, founder Sawline Bio. PhD in progress. She stepped up to the lectern. Her palms didn't sweat. She didn't clear her throat. She clicked the remote. Slide 1 graphs, hormonal fluctuation data across underserved populations. Raw, compelling, statistically airtight. Slide 2, pilot program outcomes from 3 rural clinics. Testimonials, outcomes, improvement percentages. Slide 3. A photo, her own hands gently cradling her belly. On the mirror in the background, a sticky note read, "You're not invisible. They just can't see what you're building yet." And then she spoke, I wasn't invited to this panel, but I built the science you're funding. There was no microphone drop, no dramatic music, just stillness. And then listening. She moved through the rest of the presentation: product development, roadmap, user interface, prototype, early stage funding details. The chat feature in the virtual stream began to ping with reactions. Her clarity is unreal. Wait, isn't that the same quote from the Madeline banner outside? So she's the original. And then one investor, a young woman in a sharp slate blazer, one side of her hair buzzed, eyes alight with curiosity, leaned forward and asked Dr. Grayson what motivated you to build Sawline Bio, specifically in this way. Elena didn't blink. She didn't mention her sister. She didn't invoke betrayal. She didn't bring up lawsuits or lies. She simply said, "Because we deserve tools designed by people who were told they shouldn't exist." The room stilled again. This time not in skepticism, but in awe. When she finished, there was no standing ovation, just quiet understanding, which was better. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the red skyline, she received the email. Subject line: Funding Inquiry, Sawline Bio. From Maya Denslow Verge. Impact Partners. The body of the message was short. I bet on clarity, and you have it. Let's talk. Elena stared at the screen for a moment, then closed her laptop. She didn't leap from her chair, didn't gasp. Instead, she stood, walked out of the workspace, and headed home. Her lab was quiet, not sterile lived in. One side of the room held notes, petri dishes, sealed vials. The other a low makeshift cot with soft quilts and two small figures sleeping soundly beneath them. Lila's arm was draped across Orion's chest, her curls wild and free. Orion's favorite stuffed bear, missing one ear, rested at his side. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the clock were the only sounds. Elena knelt down and gently tucked Lila's foot back under the blanket. Then she brushed a hand through Orion's hair and sat cross-legged beside them for a while, just listening. To peace. To breath. To earned quiet. She looked around the room. The compound she was refining sat safely on ice. Her research was backed up across 3 drives, and the name on every document was hers. No co-credit. No ghost signatures. Just hers. She looked down at her children again, at the future she was building not for revenge but for roots. Then, in a voice soft but steady, she whispered, "We're okay now, all 3 of us. And this time, it wasn't a wish, it was a truth."